Welcome to Preservation Virginia's Legislative Preview. I'm Elizabeth Kostelny, CEO of Preservation Virginia, and on behalf of our board, staff, and members statewide, I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. And I also want to offer the regrets from our chair, Jenny Keller, who is listening but won't be joining us as she's recovering from laryngitis. We're deeply appreciative of her leadership and that of our entire board of trustees who have guided us in our work in these uncertain times. Each year, we offer this program as a way to highlight public policy priorities related to historic preservation in the upcoming General Assembly session, and to share ways you can help support these initiatives. Your advocacy during the previous sessions has been essential in protecting and maintaining a robust historic tax credit program that adapts older buildings and supports local economies across nearly every locality in the Commonwealth. You have given voice to the need for funding to preserve African American cemeteries, land conservation, and battlefield protection programs, as well as to individual historic sites and museums that are accomplishing significant work statewide. In 2020, your advocacy helped refine the SCC process to require applicants of new transmission line construction to choose routes that avoided scenic assets, historic resources, and the environment of the area as much as reasonable and practicable. Last year, with your help, the Secretariat of Natural Resources name was revised to the Secretariat of Natural and Historic Resources to more fully reflect its scope and of authority and the Commonwealth's constitutional obligations. Each year, your advocacy ensures that the Department of Historic Resources is funded and staffed to take on the necessary work that they accomplish. Last year, that included establishing a community outreach manager and staffing additions to the easement, underwater archaeology, and African American cemeteries programs. And importantly, you've helped ensure that the state's budget and legislative initiatives expand to consider the full scope of historic sites, places, and cultural landscapes that reflect the broad, diverse, and complex history of Virginia and Virginians. Today, we've assembled a panel of experts to share their perspective on the upcoming General Assembly session. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to go over some housekeeping items that are probably well familiar to everyone after 22 months of COVID webinars, but we're recording this session and it'll be available on our website later this week. We are going to hold all questions until the end, but you can ask your questions at any time by putting them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And we'll use the chat box to share links and other information. So I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Julie Langen. Julie is well known to all of you as the director of the Department of Historic Resources. Since 2014, she's led the department as director and state historic preservation officer, bringing her more than 30 years of expertise and experience to the activities and efforts of the department. Julie?
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I want to thank Preservation Virginia for hosting this orientation and for the opportunity to be included on the program today. With the time available to me, I am going to focus my remarks on the possibility of increased funding for historic preservation. And to set the stage, I want to share what I think is common knowledge, and that is that there are no budget shortfalls to contend with, so it is not out of the question that some increases in preservation funding will come to pass. And for that reason, DHR feels cautiously optimistic going into the 22 session and feel that there is the possibility of some additional funding, not just for our programs, but for projects that are priorities at the local level. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with the budget process, the General Assembly will be working with a budget prepared by outgoing Governor Northam. And included within that budget are some, but not all, of DHR's budget requests, as well as requests that we were not a part of making, but for which funding will pass through our agency to localities. Some budget requests are for one-time expenditures and others would be for reoccurring costs. So first, just to provide a little bit of context, thank you, Will, for this first slide. It's perfectly timed. I just want to revisit what Elizabeth just touched on briefly, and that is the recent funding increases that have had a dramatically positive effect on historic preservation and have helped all of us to realize some of our preservation goals. And I've listed some of those on this slide. And just to run through them real quickly, we were out of space at our headquarters in Richmond. We got almost 7,000 square feet of additional space. We've had a multitude of IT needs and we've received additional funding for those. We've seen strong support for our highway marker program, especially in the area of diversity topics. We received another position for a cemetery person. We've seen increases in funding to the African American Cemetery Fund, an underwater position and a half, a really important community outreach initiative that funds a position as well as a grant program and an internship program, working with communities, African American and Indigenous communities. We're taking the lead on the statue of Barbara Rose Johns that will be going into the US Capitol. And then there are these numerous, what we refer to as pass-through grants. And those are the grants that have either been made direct requests directly to the governor from localities or are entered as budget amendments by General Assembly members. So we've seen a lot of increase over the last two sessions, and I think I'm safe in saying that these collectively represent the largest increase in state funding in the history of the department. So if we move on now to the next slide, I want to just briefly touch on the requests that DHR did make to the governor that have been included. And the largest and most important of these is a new program to fund a fund targeting Black, Indigenous people of color related resources. And I'm not going to say another word about that because Senator Hashmi is going to go into that in more detail. But because we are managing an increasing number of grants, some of them related to our community outreach program, some of them having to do with the cemetery grant program, National Park Service grants that we are awarded. We have so many grants that we are managing that we feel the need for another position. So we've asked for that. We also are one of the states that has yet to do a statewide inventory of resources related to the Underground Railroad. So we're eager to take that project on. And then think back to my mention of additional space at our Richmond headquarters. To use that space for its intended purpose, we need compact shelving for our archaeological collection. So we have a one-time expenditure for shelving. We have something in the budget for legal expenses because we're finding ourselves more and more often faced with the need to defend our preservation easements. And then finally, funding for the recovery of information at threatened archaeological sites. And these tend to be sites that are being impacted by storm surges and erosion. So those are the things that we asked for and that did make it into the governor's budget. Will, if you want to go to the next slide, there is then this whole category of additional projects. And just a bit of explanation, these are projects that I don't know about typically ahead of time for the most part. There are conversations between the entities making the requests and the governor's office. And then later in the process, they may be projects that individual General Assembly members make budget requests for. So those that are already included in the governor's version of the budget include what are being shown on this screen. And I would predict that there will be others that when the budget is finally approved at the end of the session are included within the budget. And there's also likely to be funding to support preparations for the America 250th celebration. So there's still a lot of opportunity for additional projects to come before the General Assembly that do relate to historic preservation. I've heard just a little bit about some of them, but none of them do I have a lot of detail about. So I don't want to exceed my time, and I'll just sum things up by saying that after many years of budget cuts, and DHR really weathered a number of significant cuts, the last couple of sessions have been very, very good for historic preservation. And the timing of these increases has been very fortuitous because it's coincided with a dramatic increase in the demand for services and access to our programs. And given the heightened interest in what we do and the relevancy today of historic preservation, further increases are in fact necessary, especially if we hope to realize the goals and objectives contained in our recently completed 6-year comprehensive plan, which was largely based on input from the public. And I'm sure some of you weighed in on that plan, and I thank you. So as Elizabeth said, there are going to be questions at the end of the program, but I invite any of you, if time doesn't permit us to get to every question, I invite you to please reach out to me directly, and I'll put my contact information into chat. But I would be glad to answer any of your questions about any of these budget requests, as well as I could direct you to additional information about each and every one of them. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. I think we all appreciate the work that the department has done all of the years, but especially over the last 22 months, when we know that there have been hurdles for everyone. And it's really great to see how the funding has come in and how you all have been able to implement so many things in the last 12 months. So thank you all. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Senator Hashmi. She was elected as representative of the Senate District 10 in 2019 and was sworn in on January 8th, 2020. She has more than 30 years of experience as an educator and academic administrator, and she's received awards and medals for diversity, inclusion, and multicultural enrichment as the administrator at J. Sargent Reynolds Community College. It's been a pleasure to work with you, Senator Hashmi, over the past 2 sessions, and so welcome.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you to Preservation Virginia for this opportunity to share a little bit of the work that we are going to be doing in this upcoming session. And I want to thank Director Langan and our DHR folks for all of the efforts that they have been spending to make sure that we are sharing, preserving, and telling the full story of Virginia's history. So I am really honored to be carrying the bill that Julie just spoke about to preserve our BIPOC history. And this is a $10 million request that has been put into the governor's budget. So I'm extremely thankful that the governor has also included this proposal in his biennium budget. And I certainly hope that we will have the full support of our General Assembly. I'm honored to be carrying this bill with Delegate McQuinn in the House, and we are certainly going to be working to tell the full story of Virginia through this particular proposal. So what does it do? This particular proposal is $10 million that conserves the historic and cultural sites that are important to Virginia's Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and make sure that we are doing everything that we can to enhance the full picture of what it means in the Commonwealth to have a collective history. One thing I was thinking about as I was reviewing the proposal that DHR had sent over is the critical fact that we actually preserve what we value. And in preserving what we value, we begin to tell a story about who we are as a culture, as a community, and as individuals. And this particular proposal is helping us move in a very important and a much more inclusive manner. If we preserve what we value, and we are now taking the effort to showcase the full history of Virginia, it is an indication that we really do value our collective history. And that's why this particular proposal is so very, very necessary. So the proposal is dedicating $10 million over 2 years, a grant program administered by DHR, and that will seek to preserve historic sites and cultural sites. And we are introducing the legislation, this particular General Assembly, and it will be the first in the Commonwealth, actually, that's dedicated to the rehabilitation and the interpretation of historic landmarks of Black, Indigenous, and people of color sites. It will protect, for instance, our historic schools, our churches, our cemeteries, our sacred tribal sites, and other endangered historic sites throughout Virginia. So what we will hope to make sure is that we're adding to our other efforts that are also already ongoing. We know that we have the Virginia Land Conservation Fund, the Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund, and the Virginia Outdoors Foundation Preservation Trust Fund. And these are really critical and important, but as you can see, we've never taken that necessary and important step to also preserve the history and the culture of so many of our other communities. So now we move in this much more expansive and inclusive manner. So this is going to be a tremendous step, and I'm so thankful that the governor has included this proposal in his budget. And I am really, really thankful that DHR has asked me to carry the legislation, and we certainly are looking for Preservation Virginia to help us not just pass the legislation, but also to work with us as we move to tell the collective history of Virginia. So thank you so much, and thank you, Elizabeth, for this opportunity to share this particular item.
Well, thank you, Senator Hashmi, and I think you have our commitment to support you as the session moves forward, and then hopefully when the fund is established to be able to support that as well. So thank you so much for your leadership on this issue. Now I'd like to introduce two folks. Our legislative efforts each year are guided by the collective minds of our next two speakers. Trip Pollard is an attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center with decades of experience in land conservation and historic preservation. He serves as the chair of our Public Policy Committee and vice chair of our Board of Trustees. And Hunter Jamerson has been our counsel during the General Assembly session. I think I counted up for almost 10 years. He brings a depth of knowledge of the legislative process and deep associations with the members, the workings of the committees, and their staffs to help us support our agenda each year. So I'll turn it over to Tripp and Hunter.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being with us, and also want to just thank everyone for the support that you've given to our advocacy efforts over the years. We have a few slides. If Will can get those up, we'll start there. There we go. And you can go to the next one. There we go. So as you heard a bit already from Director Langen as well as Elizabeth, the last session of the General Assembly was, although a very unusual one with COVID and a number of other things going on, but it was a very, very successful session for preservation. And next slide. I won't go into details because Elizabeth and Director Langen have already touched on a number of these, but we really saw some significant legislation pass, including broadening the scope of the easement program, changing the name to be the Secretary of Natural and Historic Resources, which I think is more than just a name change. I think it's and more than just a symbol. I think it really helps to elevate the importance of historic resources within state government. And also mentioned, and Director Langen especially went into detail about some of the budget items. And it has been a very successful past 2 years for preservation funding. And I think this has been some of it making up for lost ground. DHRs had to suffer budget cuts in the past, but I do think that the recent budget amendments will go a long way to strengthening Virginia's preservation program. And so I want to thank all of you again for your advocacy support for these efforts. Preservation Virginia has been deeply involved in all of those last session. And looking ahead to the 2022 session, as Director Langen mentioned, there are a number of budget items and requests, which I won't go over in detail. She laid them out very well. And those are a top priority for Preservation Virginia's advocacy program for this session. I think has been some real success in the last couple of years in staffing DHR, but I think there are some additional needs for staffing, for collections, and also for efforts such as surveying and the Underground Railroad sites in Virginia. So I think we've still got some very important needs. Very pleased that they made it into the governor's introduced budget. As was stated, that's just one step in the process. And so Preservation Virginia will be advocating in support of these budget items this coming session. Next slide. Beyond that, there's really a whole lot of uncertainty right now about the 22 session on both bills that may be introduced as well as potential budget amendments. And there's a whole lot of reasons for that uncertainty. Among other things, we have a gubernatorial transition coming up. There's a new majority in the House of Delegates. The pandemic, unfortunately, continues, and with the recent surge. And then just further complicate things, the Division of Legislative Services suffered from a ransomware attack that has delayed and complicated the drafting and filing of bills. So because of this, there's a lot of uncertainty about what else might pop up. There's a number of bills and budget items of potential interest that have been discussed. We'll see what gets introduced. But a few of those would be some adjustments to the African American Cemetery Program, some additional support for heritage tourism and recreation associated with battlefields, and perhaps some provisions regarding the consultation with tribes on state permitting. Those are just some of the areas that we may see coming and we'll be looking out for. Next slide. And then one of our top priorities, as it is every session, is the Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit. It is an incredibly successful tool, which is not news to most, if not everyone, on this webinar, both economically successful, it's jobs success, community development success, and a historic preservation success. The challenge has been over the years to defend that, which we've done with many of you. And the additional challenge this year is going to be that we have a new House Finance Chair and a lot of new members. We've got 16 new members of the House of Delegates. So there's going to be significant need for education and outreach on the Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program. And so that's going to be one of our main focuses and something we've actually already begun to do at Preservation Virginia. Next slide. And now I will turn it over to Hunter to talk some about the process and steps for involvement and what else we can look forward to in the upcoming session.
Thank you, Tripp, and good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate your participation today. It's great to see so many willing advocates for the work of Preservation Virginia. We had a lot of collective success together in the past few years and look forward to an ambitious and challenging year this year with your support. So we will kick things off January 12th. I saw Senator Hashmi looks well rested, and that's good. She's going to be busy for the next 60 days. This is what's called a long session in Virginia, long being somewhat of a misleading term in that we'll accomplish 3,000 bills in a 60-day period, but it's longer than our short sessions, which we alternate annually, which are only 45 days. So the General Assembly will have some time, but not a lot of time, to consider these challenging issues, many of which will be decided by February 9th, when the General Assembly will cross over bills from House to Senate and Senate to House. So the work of the General Assembly moves very quickly, and that's why your participation is so important in helping us achieve our policy objectives. How we'll do that this year remains a little bit unclear. Tripp noted several of the fluid conditions we're working under, but so many of the rules of the road during the legislative session are not determined until the day that session begins on the 12th, and we'll get some procedural resolutions that will guide the operations of the House and the Senate. Perhaps the most important of which to you as advocates is really what the public involvement opportunities will be. Obviously, we're all continuing to live in the COVID pandemic, and we're also sorting out, logistically how the General Assembly will work. We're back in person this year, but it's not clear whether House or Senate or both will have any virtual or remote participation opportunities, or whether public involvement will be limited to one site here at the Pocahontas Building in Richmond. So we'll certainly be updating you on the mechanisms to participate. But in the meantime, encourage you to get involved through the updates we'll be providing through our Virginia Action Alerts, where we'll detail for you, and I'll go into further detail here in the next slide, Preservation Virginia's policy priorities, as well as some calls to action and the mechanisms to do so. So we'll take the next slide. So I mentioned our legislative reporting process, these email alerts that we send out. If you're not presently signed up, we can get you signed up through the Preservation Virginia website and through outreach to the Preservation Virginia staff. But encourage you to enroll if you're not receiving these weekly updates as session begins. We'll have one out at the start of session here to update some of the themes from today, as well as the known items that have been filed as session embarks. But we try to get these alerts out and update our website archive each Monday, reflecting the last week's actions, so that you can review them, understand the policies that are being debated, provide direct feedback to the Preservation Virginia staff, so we can incorporate it into our advocacy efforts, and to provide you with the information you need to then ultimately reach out to your legislators. And I see that Preservation Virginia staff has added the link to subscribe to the emails there in the chat. So again, if you're not presently enrolled to receive the alerts, please click through that that link and enroll. It's important that as you heed our calls to action and reach out to your legislators, that we know how that conversation went. So if you do reach out, let us know. And as you receive feedback from your delegate, senator, or their staff, also please let us know. Those primary source communications are invaluable to us. Tripp and I are walking the halls each day of the General Assembly, but there's 140 doors that we have to cover. There's many more of you than there are of us, and you have a direct constituent relationship in many cases with many of the key decision makers. So again, participating in our process through receipt and comprehension of these alerts, and then your participation as we issue calls to action is especially helpful. And then at the end of session, we'll wrap up, bills that passed, bills that failed, and bills that are subject to further action by the governor. And then we'll summarize those gubernatorial actions after the legislative veto session in the spring. So if we can click through the last slide, I'll ask Tripp to wrap up our segment.
Thanks, Hunter. So as Hunter mentioned, we encourage you to visit and stay up to date through a website, sign up for the emails. We will be putting up website updates. And then I would also like to mention another aspect of our legislative program is we will be having a legislative reception on Wednesday, February 9th. It is going to be online this year due to ongoing pandemic. And you see the registration information there up on the screen. And also encourage you all to sponsor and help support this. This is the way that we fund our legislative and other policy work for Preservation Virginia. So, and also, as Hunter mentioned, just as important as anything is to be sure to engage with your legislators. So thank you very much for your support of Preservation Virginia's policy efforts. And I will turn it back over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Tripp. Since we're on this idea of advocacy and how we advocate, I wonder if Senator Hashmi has any good advice to us, having had a session, virtual session where constituents are trying to get in touch with their legislators, and what's the most effective way to communicate?
I think that's a great question. And while each office does constituent outreach a little bit differently, I think most of us really, really appreciate when our own constituents are reaching out directly and talking about issues that impact them, their families, or their communities. And having that direct relationship is very important. One thing I know we often get during session or just before session is that we get flooded with emails. And a lot of times they're on particular issues that are important to a variety of different advocacy groups or constituents. But a lot of times those emails are simply cut and paste, and they're mass emails that will hit our inboxes, but they're all saying the same thing, and they're not differentiating the fact that this is a constituent who's directly reaching out to us, or just a large mass mailing from an advocacy group. So I think the best way to elicit a response and make a connection is to do it personally, to write a personal email or to make a personal phone call that highlights why the issue, the topic is important. And that often has much more impact on each of us, because we know that we're talking to someone who lives within our district and that they are highlighting a concern that is of really critical importance. In addition to that, I think a lot of our offices will continue to have constituent meetings. I know we have 3 options in my office, and we use Calendly, the scheduling software that is very convenient. So people can schedule meetings and they can be on Zoom or by phone or in person. We are going to be taking a cautious approach to in-person meetings, given the spread of Omicron. And so we will likely be encouraging people to make appointments by Zoom. But I know every office is going to do things a little bit differently, but we certainly do encourage constituent outreach and would love to be chatting with you on the issues that are important to you.
Thanks so much for that. I think that's very, very helpful. There was another question in the chat box that probably goes to the group, and wanting to know if if there's a bill that's going to look at penalties for businesses or contractors who willfully desecrate Black cemeteries and land. So I don't know who wants.
Well, there are already laws in place that protect cemeteries. So if someone knows of a situation where they're aware of cemeteries being destroyed, they should bring that to the attention of their local government and law enforcement. And they're certainly welcome to reach out to DHR's cemetery specialist, Joanna Wilson Green, who can also advise them on steps to take. But that is against the law.
Great. Thank you. There was a question about whether this will be review is being recorded, and yes, it is, and it will be posted. Do our panelists have any things they forgot or things they'd like to add right now? You've been so thorough. There are very few questions.
Julie, did you have something you read?
I just want to thank everybody for advocating for the needs of the Department of Historic Resources over the years. And I should have said that when I first had the opportunity, and I realized that I hadn't. So thank you very, very much. The only reason we've been successful in getting increases in funding is because we've had strong advocates who reach out to members, and that is the key. So thank you so much for that. And thank you to Senator Hashmi for agreeing to be patron of the BIPOC bill. We're very proud of this concept, and we're really hopeful that we will have a new program put into place after July 1st.
So we had another question that came up in the chat about, do we have any known challenges in this legislative session?
I think the greatest challenge, Tripp really highlighted in one of his slides, is just the general turnover in the General Assembly, not so much change of parties, but just in power, but change of faces. And we're 16 different faces in the House this upcoming session. And if you go across the entirety of the General Assembly, probably 40% of the composition of the General Assembly has turned over since we had robust debate around the historic rehabilitation tax credit previously. So I think our greatest challenge is primarily educational and making sure that new members are familiar, and members of committees that are now going to be on the Finance Committee or now going to be on the Natural Resources Committee who weren't before are read into our issues. And that's where your participation is so helpful, because again, you're going to have those constituent relationships to help us tell the local stories in your districts about the benefits that historic preservation can bring. But we've got a lot of educating to do, and that's a lot of ground to cover in a 60-day period. Tripp may want to build onto that.
Yeah, I think that is critical, as we both emphasize. I mean, there are a lot of new faces, and I think especially with the historic rehabilitation tax credit in a session where there's going to be a lot of talk about funding, as Director Langen mentioned. Thankfully, we're not in one of these situations where we're looking to cut a lot of things, but their taxation is going to be on the table in a lot of ways. And so I think there is going to be some looking at revenues. And we've seen in the past, at least, when people start to look at revenues, questions come up about the historic rehab tax credit. Preservation Virginia, as well as DHR, have done a lot of research over the years to demonstrate the economic impacts and the job impacts of that tax credit. And the Independent Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission looked at that tax credit and concluded it was incredibly effective at accomplishing its purpose. So I think we've got a great story to tell. And I think a lot of you who are on this webinar have been excellent at conveying that story and telling specific examples, which is what is particularly, I think, compelling for legislators to hear about examples in their district. But we have a great storehouse of information. That's some of what we will be sharing with as part of the education of legislators. And we'd be glad to share and help arm you if you have any meetings set up with your legislators. But again, more than anything else, just giving examples of successful projects has done the most, in my experience, to convince legislators of the importance of this tax credit. We've been able to continue in a very strong fashion, but not without a lot of work. So again, thanks for all you all do for that. And I think that's something that will definitely is going to be a priority for us, is to educate and keep an eye on any possible attacks on that in the upcoming session.
And I'll just tag on to Tripp's appreciation. I reached out to a number of you across the Commonwealth right after the elections to be in contact with some of the new legislators that are coming in. And I know that you have been able to share the stories of success and economic impact in your localities. And I think that's important before they get to the General Assembly, when the session begins, when they don't have as much time to really soak everything up. So that's a 12-month, 365-day a year goal that we have to make sure that we're educating everybody on the benefits of these. So there's a question there are questions in the chat that are coming through. Let's see. Okay. Just a comment that there needs to be laws strengthened to protect cemeteries. And yes, Parker Agilesto just put in the chat that Andrew Wheeler is, as we understand it, is being proposed for the Secretary of Natural Resources. I don't think we can answer your question about his knowledge about historic resources at this point. This is breaking news this morning, so we're all soaking that piece in too.
Yeah. I will say, as Tripp was talking about the need to educate new members, every 4 years the department is faced with educating a new secretary, and it's typical that whoever serves in that position is stronger in the area of natural resources than they are in the area of historic resources. So that's something that we're prepared to take on, and it will be a priority for us to familiarize the new secretary with the state and federal preservation programs and to help educate them.
And I think that will definitely, that's an excellent point, Julie. I mean, it's certainly going to be a key effort for Preservation Virginia as well, as educating the new administration and the new secretary. It is something we do every 4 years. I will also say that I think an earlier question kind of related to, and then the follow-up was mentioning Andrew Wheeler's possible nomination. I think that the governor-elect did not say a whole lot about historic preservation in his campaign, but he has stressed the importance of tourism and economic development. And again, I think we have an extremely good story to tell about historic preservation. And that's why it's been something tools like the Historic Rehab Tax Credit have enjoyed very strong bipartisan support. And so we fully hope and expect that will continue.
Absolutely. I think.
If I might just, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just, if I could just share, I know we're expecting a lot of change and new faces in the General Assembly, but I just want to remind everybody that the Virginia Senate stays the same. And there is a consistency from the past 2 years, at least, as we go forward in the next 2 years. And our committees and our committee chairs are not going to be changing. So if you've built relationships and have been reaching out to your senators, that is an area of continuity. And we would certainly encourage you to continue to reach out and share your insights with the folks in the Senate with whom you've already established relationships.
It's a great point. Thank you. There was a question about where you can find the draft budget. And I know it's on the General Assembly's website. Is that, I know some things have been inaccessible. Is that accessible now after the?
It is. I will tell you, in terms of navigation, the easiest way to find the draft budget is through the Department of Planning and Budget website. I'm happy to put that in the chat, but it's DPB, the abbreviation for Department of Planning and Budget.virginia.gov, and I'll put that in the chat.
Okay. Looks like. Great. Well, I want to thank everybody for participating today and for our, this has been very helpful. I think that we all have a better sense of some of the questions as we're moving forward to next week. And we appreciate your time that you've invested in preparing for today, to all of our speakers. We also appreciate the sponsorships that have made this session and our legislative reception, virtual legislative reception possible. They really do help us carry out the good work that we're doing here. So a couple things to remember is please do sign up for Preservation Virginia alerts and to stay in touch over the course of the session. And we try to send out an alert on the Monday after every Monday morning, just to update you on the status of the bills and the budget items that we're tracking. Sometimes the week before is very busy and bleeds into the weekend, so it doesn't happen right on time, but that's our goal, is to get that information out to you each Monday. And then I would encourage you to look out for information about our legislative reception scheduled for February 9th at 7 p.m. We intend to focus on the economics of historic preservation, and hopefully that will help continue to educate folks. So thank you for attending this afternoon, and we will see you out, I guess, in the virtual airwaves in the near future. Thank you.